Hello, and welcome to the course called A Key Christian Figure, in which we will be looking at the work of British theologian Andrew Shanks, theologian of shakenness, as we can call him. In this video, I'll introduce some of the key ideas we see in his approach, but don't worry if they don't click with you the first time. We'll discuss them together when we meet, but I wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of the ideas to ponder for yourselves first. You may well wonder, why Andrew Shanks? What makes him a key Christian figure? Surely there are so many other people to consider, much more obvious giants of the faith and theology. Because the fact is, despite having written about 12 or 13 books, he's not very well known. Though Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury, has said that Andrew Shanks is the most significant Anglican theologian today. But why have I selected a British theologian? And yet another white one, yet another man, yet another middle class and ordained and Anglican theologian, when there are so many different possibilities? Well, first, it's a good question and an important one, and at one level the answer is simple. His work became critical for me during my doctoral research. His ideas gave me the framework for my analysis, and his thinking has stayed with me, informing how I make connections between different issues. But secondly, there's something else here as well. Like Andrew, I too am a white, Western, middle-class man, and in those ways privileged within society and within theology. After all, much of our theology has been written by people quite like him and quite like me. But the thing about Shanks is that he poses some really useful questions for examining this establishment. He helps me face up to those privileges and interrogate where I stand. He is an insider, as I am in some ways, who helps me find ways of building alliances, or we can call it solidarity, with people whose experiences or insights are quite different. Of course, there's a tension here, which we can discuss further, because on the one hand, he affirms that theology must be an ever-expanding conversation consisting of many global voices, so in a sense he is critical of a system which privileges his own voice. But at the same time, his particular contribution sheds light on the very systems we think and work within. In fact, he's commenting on the nature of sin and truth, often couched in quite philosophical terms, but with clearly political implications in terms of power and hospitality. In fact, he aims to foster particular sensitivity or alertness to the connections that can be made in many different directions. His theology is a big picture theology, which means it gives us tools for analysing all sorts of issues and possibilities. But hang on a minute. If he's a big picture theologian, how contextual is he? Doesn't he run the risk of the typical Western thinker assuming his big picture can speak for everyone? Well, that is something we will need to check out. But what I'll say at this stage is his big picture does not claim to fill it all in, but is actually a big picture which explicitly allows for and invites and responds to the insights of fresh experience which it encounters and which challenges him, me, you, each of us. It is a big picture which says the big picture itself is still unfolding. The story is not yet finished. In fact, the very nature of this story is to receive from the insights of other stories, not least those that have gone unheard, those that have been silenced, and even sacrificed. So what I'm hoping to show at this stage is that Andrew Shanks is worth considering, first because I found him to be extremely useful personally, both in terms of examining things we take for granted and in terms of making connections with all sorts of other movements within theology. Secondly, sometimes it's important to give voice to people who are insiders, but who unpick the privileges of the insiders, and are therefore allies with others who also raise critical questions. And thirdly, he gives language for things which many people seem to find helpful, in the sense that he helps to put into new words things that people have previously felt. So it's not entirely new. He's building on other work, but at the same time, his language and his framework or analysis somehow helps us to look in a fresh way at Christian faith and theology and mission. He opens it up in a new way, expanding the horizon and encouraging ever greater solidarity amongst us. So just to say those again, Firstly, Shanks helps us ask good questions about our own assumed worldview, what we take for granted, whoever we are, not just people like me, but whichever groups we belong to. And he helps to make connections with other sorts of critical perspectives and movements, which also encourage self-criticism. Secondly, in a way, he is a good model of what an insider to privilege might show us. That is, how as a person of privilege I might interrogate my own position, and therefore build alliances with people in other sorts of movement that are asking those sorts of questions. How might I open up to other voices? And thirdly, he offers a big picture which simultaneously can feel familiar, connecting with other approaches, and opening up the landscape of Christian faith in a particular and interesting way, well worth exploring. So that's a bit of a flavour of why I think he's worth considering. So let's turn now to some of the detail. Briefly, in terms of what I call the gospel according to Shanks. You won't find a nice, neat passage in one of his books which expresses it quite like this. This is my attempt to bring together, to synthesize the key narrative in what he's saying about Christian faith. So first, where many of us would talk about God as grace, Shanks talks in terms of hospitality. God is the most hospitable God imaginable, lovingly creating space for us in all our diversity, even though we're not exactly like God ourselves. This is the heart of Christian faith, God's love for us, God's grace for us, God's hospitality extended to us, even though we do not manage to be as loving, as gracious, as hospitable ourselves. It's normally understood as God's love for sinners. So it's a very traditional point, but Shanks draws some conclusions from it, which not everyone draws. His point is that God's love, God's grace, God's hospitality is effectively scandalous, as the New Testament sometimes indicates. It is hospitality which extends beyond what human beings assume it should be, and what human beings seem capable of. Hospitality for the wrong sorts of people, hospitality for those who fall short, hospitality for outsiders, even hospitality for those who are inhospitable. For Shanks, this is the very truth of God, and the very truth of the gospel. He calls it truth as honesty in his earlier book, Faith in Honesty, but he changes it to truth as openness in later books. It is truth, but not quite as we know it, because it is truth as a way of being, the very truth of divine hospitality, extended towards all creation. The sheer miraculous art of being empathetically open to all sorts of otherness, all the ways that creatures differ from God but are still embraced by God. It can't be explained or even exactly captured by our words or beliefs or actions, but it's the very truth of things, the truth that underpins creation, God's expansive embrace of what is other than God. Now, human beings can sometimes demonstrate such truth which is marked by openness to that which is not like us, that which is different from us, that which doesn't fit, to people who don't fit with our expectations or assumptions. Sometimes we do manage to be hospitable, to be open to fresh experience, to receive the other graciously. But more often, we place limits on it. We find ways to put a cap on our hospitality, opting for what he calls cliché, prejudice, or thought gone stale, to fit it into what feels manageable, sensible, less scandalous. This is due to what Shanks calls truth as correctness, the more normal understanding of truth, which we understand in terms of something being correct, where we mean that it fits with presuppositions we already have. Truth as correctness is judged to be truth on the basis that we know what we're looking for. It fits with reality as we understand it, which is why it can become cliched. So truth as correctness always involves some sort of loyalty to preconceived notions. It will always be more limited, more manageable, more rooted in a particular experience of the world. If you like, it can seem more contextual, truth true to the particular features of us in our world as we see things. Though interestingly, I would say contextual theologies also challenge these notions of truth as correctness, because truth as correctness is usually determined by a particular group of people. generally some sort of an elite, at least a clique, who decide what correctness will look like, and who even interpret and shape the gospel so that its scandalous hospitality is tamed into something more manageable for us, since we find truth as openness too demanding. But I see Shanks's approach as intercontextual, seeking to take seriously each context, but to build a picture bigger than any single context, always building more and more relationships beyond the particular setting. This tension between truth as openness and truth as correctness, the truth where truth as openness is the truth of God's hospitality, and truth as correctness is the more limited version of truth with which we are familiar. This tension is at the heart of what we call sin. As Shanks explains, original sin is unatonement, a word he coins to capture the condition of being not at one with reality, in the sense that we are closed to aspects of reality. We filter it, we manage it, massage it, allow it to be edited, because reality in all its fullness is too much to bear. Truth as openness would open us up to it, in all its diversity, all its awkwardness, all its pain, and all its potential, opening us up to it lovingly, generously, empathetically. But truth as correctness instead is a way of editing it, limiting ourselves so that we don't have to engage with it. And this civil war within us between that which is unchangeable or resistant to fresh experience and that which is changeable, open to fresh experience, is about the contrast between these two kinds of truth, whether we're open to reality or whether we filter and edit it. And because the editing or resistance tends to win as we cling to familiar truth as correctness, we remain unatoned to reality in various ways, closed down to other people's experiences or their full humanity. In other words, unatonement is at the heart of our unneighbourliness. By contrast, the impulse towards truth as openness, the impulse towards true atonement, the true opening up towards reality, hospitably, generously, empathetically, lovingly, graciously, is at the heart of the gospel and at the heart of what saves us from being inwardly closed and closed to our neighbour. Jesus shows us this way, this truth, this life, the good news of truth as openness, which embraces us even though we fail to show it ourselves. This is the scandal of the gospel. The point is that it shakes us out of our truth as correctness. It opens us up to greater apprehension of and greater relationship with the fullness of reality. It shakes us into solidarity with people and experiences and stories that are different from our own. It shakes us out of our closedness, the ways we succumb to elites telling us a limited version of reality, opening up a wider horizon, the solidarity of the shaken, which is Shanks's understanding of the kingdom of God. So the problem is unatonement and our closedness to reality in various ways. But God is at work opening us up to the full scandal of the good news of God's hospitality, which opens us up beyond each truth as correctness, each partial grasp of reality, and builds a more expansive solidarity of the shaken. Slowly, painstakingly, self-critically, but hopefully, in hope that this is the way of abundant life. But there are particular ways in which unatonement affects our grasp of the gospel, which Shanks calls dishonesties. 3 ways in which unatonement manifests itself in us, individually and in groups, including in religion. And the gospel works against these dishonesties, but they are resilient. And in sessions 2, 3, and 4, we will consider them in turn to see what they are, how they work, and how Shanks's insights into them relate to other kinds of theology, to see how his vision of truth as openness finds allies, builds solidarity with different sorts of movement concerned to foster this expansive vision, the solidarity of the shaken, witnessing to and embodying God's scandalous hospitality. I look forward to being with you to explore these ideas and see what you make of them.